A famous poet has called this the age of anxiety. He meant that a certain sense of fear and of terror characterizes much of our lives. To many of us, like poetic license. But I don't think you'll accuse me of poetic exaggeration if I suggest that the fear and terror that this patient shows is something with which all of us are in some measure familiar.
It's just unreasoning fear, shakiness, dizziness, every awful feeling that can grip a human being is what hits you when you've got one of these panic bouts.
And so now you've been totally unable to work for how long?
Close to 3 years.
3 years without being able to go out of the house to work. Now this is serious. Why is it so? Doesn't he want to work? Could he if he wanted to? It's this kind of question that keeps coming up all the time when we consider these conditions called the psychoneuroses. We joke about them, but we can't entirely shrug them off because they come too close.
And I feel as though I'm going to be sick. Sick to my stomach, sick all over the place, and can hardly wait to get out of the living room. I've run down into the basement and walked back and forth until they subsided, picked up things, put them back again, dusted off the oil furnace, all to simply keep doing something. Otherwise, I felt that I'd explode if I didn't do this.
And if you exploded?
I don't know what would happen. That is the frightening part of it. I don't know what would happen.
Both the popular and scientific term for the condition from which our patient suffers is anxiety. Here it has become a disabling disease. Anxiety is only one of the conditions called psychoneuroses. Let's look at the field with Dr. Nathan Epstein of McGill University.
Anxiety or fear is every neurosis, but there are other forms it takes, such as compulsions, where a person is forced to do any number of ritualistic things, such as washing their hands frequently against their own desires. There are depressions, or more sad than they should be for any particular realistic situation. And there are what we call character neuroses, which are really things that most people don't recognize as disturbances or as upsets, but which require them to live their lives in a certain way where they're not reaching or developing their optimal potential inside themselves due to some underlying deficit.
You say fear is behind everything. What are people afraid of?
Most people don't know what they're afraid of. And really, this is where the great discoveries of Freud at the turn of the century uncovered. Freud discovered the concept of the unconscious mind. As long as we only look at the thing from a surface point of view, we really can't understand these problems of neurosis at all. But when we begin to discover that individuals have their fears and anxieties about which they themselves are not aware, and what an effect this has on their behavior and functioning, then we discover that a good part of each person's functioning is out of awareness, or, putting it another way, in the unconscious mind. Now, usually the unconscious mind is revealed in our dreams, in the play of children, in daydreams, and also in the symptoms of a neurosis or a psychosis.
Now back to our man, disabled by anxiety, which we all know, but which we cope with where he seemingly can't. He had a good job in his own office and some responsibility, and he was active in community affairs and in sports until 3 years ago. He talks with Dr. A.M. Marcus of the Montreal General Hospital.
The very first attack came completely out of the blue. I was feeling as well as you obviously do. One moment, and the next moment I was a nervous wreck. It struck me, firstly, a jolt, almost like electricity seemed to go through me from head to foot. And I got up, my heart began to pound. I think that was caused by fear. I possibly thought I was having a heart attack, although I'd always thought I was physically fit. And suddenly, I glanced down, and I had this impulse, not to lie down, but to hurl myself down at full length upon the floor. And I fought this off because it was such a horrible thought. I didn't consider the possibility of injury at the time, but instead I staggered, and that's exactly what I did, to the window, and I threw it open, wide open. It was an extremely cold day. And I stood there taking great gulps of air. And finally, it began to subside just a wee bit, and I went back to my desk, and I sat down, I put my head on my arms. But the minute I closed my eyes, this became intolerable. Once again, I had to open my eyes, and I kept being hit with these terrible jolts of pure unreasoning panic for over 2 hours before it began to ease off just a wee little bit. That was the beginning.
It is with you now.
Oh, yes.
Could you tell me something about this feeling that's in you now?
Yes, at this precise moment I feel dizzy. I have a sort of a pressure. I feel a pressure above my eyes. And presumably behind the forehead. And I feel extremely tense. And also there's a great deal of activity in the abdomen.
Would you like a cigarette?
Yes, thank you. Thanks. The fact that I've always felt pretty sure of myself, pretty confident, and at this time I feel absolutely a mess. I feel that this is going to get the best of me, and no matter how many times it happens, I'm as much terrified of it as I was years ago. I have never learned to live with it, or to contain it, although I must, to a certain degree, be containing it. But to go through it each time is just as frightening as the time before. And you never know when it's going to strike. I can never really relax. I'm always on guard against it. And in between, I'm more or less exhausted. It wears you out. And I find myself sometimes almost completely beaten by it.
What can you do now? What is the limit that you can go to?
Well, as far as movement, getting around, I can't do anything in that direction.
How do you mean? Tell me about that.
Well, for example, if you asked me to go downtown, you might as well put a gun to my head. I couldn't do it.
Could you go out to post a letter?
On occasion, I've been able to. Other occasions, I couldn't. Sometimes I've been able to walk 10 blocks. On another occasion, I couldn't walk half a block if I was to be shot. And I suppose if you set fire to my house, I'd get out of it. That'd be about the extent of it. In other words, the last refuge of a coward, I suppose. But it's very real. It may be in the mind, but it's awfully real and it's awfully horrifying. I went to a doctor or two, general practitioners, and so they'd say, well, here, have a pill, old chap. And, I've had every tranquilizer I think that's been made.
I see.
And I either got no effect or I got undesirable side effects. Some would make me walk as though I were drunk. Others would put me so much on edge that it was worse than feeling as I did without them. Others would keep me awake, and others would make me dopey. So without panning the industry in general, they didn't do me any good. One would have to live it in order to know just how horrible it is. I had never dreamed at one time that such feelings could possibly grip a person, and that one could tolerate it, but evidently you learn to live with it after a fashion. The first 4 years I carried on. That is, working, of course, gradually my social life. There wasn't much of it, but I belonged to certain organizations. And I gradually had to discontinue that, discontinue certain sports in which I was very active. In other words, I was withdrawing, I suppose, but doing it reluctantly and slowly, until the last thing I was doing was going to work and coming home, not going out. And then eventually, of course, 2.5 years ago or so, I got to the point where I couldn't even do that. That was, well, the end insofar as me as a functioning human being was concerned.
Dr. Epstein, what made him stop where the rest of us keep going even though we may be anxious or depressed or tired?
Well, what made him stop is a particular characteristic pattern he's developed over the years, undoubtedly from his earlier childhood on, up until the present, of handling his inner fears and rages.
But he was doing all right until a few years ago.
I don't believe that he was doing all right. He was doing better than he was doing now, but I'm sure that if we went back further into his history, we would see trouble spots way back then.
Even though he was managing a job and
Yes.
doing a lot of community stuff and
Quite.
so on. Well, don't you think that there's something in it when people say, oh, a person like this needs a good kick in the pants?
Well, to counter that, it never works. I've never seen it work. This is, I think, a moral exhortation that we like to pride ourselves in giving to others and in giving to ourselves, but it's really not a very scientific approach.
Well, everybody has a good deal of difficulty in the mere business of living, and it's a hard job.
No question about it, but some of us are perhaps more fortunate in the choice of our backgrounds, if you want to be facetious about it, in the choice of our parents, in the choice of our family structure. And we develop a sounder approach to the problems of the difficulties that come up in life.
Well, now, what can this man do?
Well, this man at the moment obviously resorts to defective means of handling his fears and his anxieties. Very frequently, we as humans tend to generally go back to earlier means of handling specific problems, means that may have been effective then but are no longer effective now.
Do you mean as a child?
As a child. For instance, a child gets frightened of something, his first instinct very frequently is to run to mommy for protection. Now, this is very effective for a child, but unfortunately, it's not very effective for an adult to return to a more or less infantile state to handle his fears now.
This is the kind of thing that he is doing if he doesn't go out of his house?
On a symbolic level, yes. In his unconscious mind, his gradual increasing restriction of his life is returning to a more helpless, regressed, more dependent state.
Does he know this?
I don't think he does at all.
Can one know it and still do it?
One can know it and still do it. This is one of the interesting problems that face us. We can become aware of our unconscious, but just becoming aware alone, while very helpful, is not the total answer.
Now our patient is faced with some hard questions about not working. What's he think about others and of himself? What's he holding in? What's he covering up? What about his own mental state? What does he think of that?
On one occasion, I was driving up to a place in the country, and I was fine as long as I was at the wheel. There wasn't much traffic on the road, and everything was going fine. But we had to pull into this place to gas up. And the minute the car was stopped, and I looked down the road, a straight road ahead of us, I suddenly had an almost overwhelming urge to jump out of the car and run down the road. I couldn't even look at the other passengers in the car. And this blinding panic gripped me to such an extent that, I was literally oozing sweat from trying to fight it. A feeling that I would collapse completely, that I might even scream or shut out.
What would happen if you screamed or
Well, it would
shouted
certainly, it might indicate that I was suffering a lack of, or loss of control.
Do you ever have the feeling that when you're lifting the coffee cup or looking at the paper that you're going to suddenly throw it away or
Yes.
give in to some unexpected
Yes.
impulse that
Yes, that's
overwhelms you?
right. On several occasions, when holding a glass, I've had an impulse to take it and smash it against the wall. On another occasion, I was visiting with some friends, and I had a glass of ale in front of me, and incidentally, I scarcely ever touched the stuff. And I was looking at the table and listening to the small talk, and it seemed to buzz and become meaningless, and I was seized with a very irrational impulse that frightened me. It was to seize the edge of the table and simply tip it. And this horrified me, because obviously it was an insane impulse.
This loss of control worries you?
Oh, indeed. I had a dread horror of ever surrendering to that.
In your imagination, what do you feel that you might do if you lost control like this?
I have no feeling that I was going to harm anyone or kill anyone, or if I've tried to think about it, I'd end up in a hospital, I'd end up here or there. And,
what sort of hospital do you think you'd end up in if you collapsed and screamed and...
Or you are afraid that if you really lose control of yourself to such an extent, you might be placed away in an asylum or somewhere.
So the overwhelming fear is that you'd lose control and perhaps go crazy?
I think that insanity, or going crazy as you phrase it, I prefer the gentler term. I think it's simply withdrawal from reality when the reality is too harsh to face. Thus far, that hasn't happened to me, because I've had a pretty rugged constitution all my life, and a fairly high IQ, which poses an added hazard in my view. I've often said that for the first time in my life, I envy those who are stupid, because they don't seem prone to attacks such as this.
This must make your wife and family fairly upset. I mean, the fact that you're the breadwinner and are stuck in all the time.
Knowing me as they do, they realize that if I am this way, there must be a very good reason for it. That brand or degree of sympathy hasn't been extended to me by others, because I'm a fairly big fellow, and they automatically assume that there can't be anything wrong with me, because there's nothing showing outwardly. And I've often said if I had 2 legs and 2 casts, I would get an appropriate amount of sympathy. Not that I'm looking for it, I'm looking for understanding, which you don't get from the great unwashed in a situation like this.
You talk often about the unwashed and the massive public. How do you feel about me?
I have no feelings about you. You're a doctor, and I'm a patient. There's nothing personal. I don't think we'd be buddy-buddy in private life.
Why not?
Well, I don't think we have much in common. Now, that should be obvious. You are a medical doctor specializing in psychiatry. I am one who didn't get to college. But although that needn't create a barrier, many of my best friends can't be blamed for the fact that they went to college. And they're nice fellows. But a BA doesn't automatically guarantee that they're intelligent. Although I don't look down on men who are intelligent. I admire them very much. And I feel in many ways that I'm just as good as they are, self-taught. That's a delusion, well, at least it's a very pleasant one.
What do you do when you feel angry?
Well, I simply bottle it up, I presume. At one time I used to lash out physically. That is, it didn't take much to involve me in a brawl. I didn't believe in wasting time talking, but I was told that this wasn't good and that I would get along much better with people if I resisted the impulse to use my fists and simply walk away, and I began doing that. And this might have led to this explosion in the office that day, if it may be called that.
How do you mean?
Well, possibly. I know that at that time I was bottling up many frustrations, and I do believe that this choking, for example, was possibly an attempt to choke down the way I was feeling. And the desire to collapse may have been to remove myself from possibly taking some more aggressive action. I don't know.
You have been constantly defending yourself against any real feelings by this verbal screen that you put up.
You assume I'm merely adapting this type of style of English for this specific occasion?
I think this is why you use so many words.
If one is fond of reading and picks up words, knows how to employ them properly, this is good. You're able to communicate with your fellow man, and that's what we're doing at this precise moment. You'd have fun with me if I couldn't even understand what you were saying. And you would be awkward using two-syllable words, Dr. Marcus. I have no grim and deep, dark secrets to hide from you.
You seem rather angry.
Yes, well, your continued suggestion that I'm being evasive, although you didn't term it that way, you meant the same thing. I've had this thrust at me many times, and I don't think there's any foundation for it. It tends to make a person angry when their integrity is challenged.
Well, it seems to me that we have here a very angry young man.
What he's trying to do is that he's trying to protect himself and defend himself against the onslaught of his inner rage and hostility.
Where does it come from?
Everybody, this is an innate biological response. Cannon, the great scientist, spoke of it as the flight and fight response, so that it is a very healthful response. But in our society, for some reason or other, there are tremendous taboos against the overt, outward expression of rage and anger, particularly. Well, most of us handle it more or less efficiently than in the case of actual cases of neuroses, full-blown neuroses. But almost everybody in the society has some problem with fear and rage.
Well, how are you going to have people going around expressing fear and anger all the time when control is obviously necessary if we're going to live together?
It's a very definitely known fact that when people are able to express these things in a more open, more effective manner, then we don't have the reciprocal feedback where it's continually building up. It's when we don't express it directly and effectively that it builds up and we feel swamped by it at all times. From our experience in the field of the neuroses, we see what a tremendously disastrous effect this business of denying and distorting our feelings has in our functioning. It can lead to all kinds of disturbances. It can lead to physical illness.
Like what?
It can lead to any physical illness that one might mention. It can lead to a variety of symptoms, headaches, ulcers, blood pressure problems, asthma.
In a sense, instead of expressing your anger to others, you're taking it out through yourself?
Somehow or other it happens that way. That somehow or other the tension that is being generated by these feelings is being discharged within the body into our various organ systems, which then become diseased. I mean, this is the concept of stress and tension. This is just as much destructive as, for instance, germs.
Well, would you recommend that every time people feel anger that they express it, no matter where they are?
I think in most cases, if we use tact in doing so, we can do it effectively. I see a lot of patients who tell me, I can't express anger at my wife. She would be hurt. She would be demolished. And yet, when he learns how to handle it more effectively, he's then able to express it more openly, and the wife very frequently is glad that he does so, because at least then she knows what's bothering him. And instead of being demolished by it, she's quite happy by it and reacts accordingly.
So even though we may not know exactly what is making us angry about it, we need to express it in some way.
We need to first accept the fact, to become aware of the fact that we are emotionally upset at a given time, and learn how to deal with it directly instead of being afraid of it and running away from it.
Which is what this man of ours has been doing.
We have a clear picture here of how he's trying to deny and run away from the fact of how angry he is.
Well, let's talk with our patient again about his irrational impulses, and about how he handles his hostility, and about what treatment he's taking.
Well, I believe right now I'm a very sick man. Not organically. I'm not in A1 physical condition, but I'm organically sound. I believe I'm mentally sound.
You believe you're mentally sound?
Now, let's put it this way. I believe I'm in contact with reality, that I am not insane. I believe if I were, this would not be so painful to me.
Which is the most recent occasion in which you felt overwhelmed like this?
Well, just last night. I was lying in bed. I was very wide awake.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone else,
Mm-hmm.
as far as I know, was asleep.
Mm-hmm.
I was lying there, and my heart began to pound.
Mm-hmm.
And my imagination began to run riot. Once again, it was the same old pattern, the muscles jumping in my chest and in my legs, my hands.
Show me.
Going
I'd like to see more. Where do you mean the muscles were jumping?
Right here, well, the pectoral muscles, the muscles here in any event, were jumping so much that my pajama top was moving.
Mm-hmm.
And this hand was going like this, almost like the stage of epilepsy again. And always the right hand, generally, although whether that is of any significance. My heart was beating probably 200 a minute. Suddenly I broke out in a sweat, and I was tempted to go down to the nurse. And on other occasions when I tried that, I had literally had to support myself along a wall as I went down. That's how dizzy I was. So I think it's more than just in my imagination.
Are you taking any medicines at the moment to help you with this?
Yes, I am. I am taking insulin therapy, plus some type of sleeping pill that doesn't work.
Tell me more about this overwhelming feeling that you have that you may become helpless and totally dependent.
I'm an adult, a person who functioned fairly well for many years, and I do consider and think and worry about the possibility that I may get to such a stage that I would never recover from it. And nothing could be worse than that, could it?
Why do you say that?
Well, to be absolutely dependent upon others, you'd be a drag on them, you'd be a burden, you'd probably cause some of them to crack up emotionally as well.
Sometimes people may love you enough to want to look after you.
Oh, I have no doubt of that. I don't feel the rejected child. But hospital is the place to be for one in my condition.
You feel much safer here?
Well, yes, certainly. I feel that if things get desperate or grim, which they do occasionally, I'm close. That medical health is close at hand. And when you're away from that, that is simply something that adds again to this feeling of despair that you get.
How despairing are you?
I once made the remark that if I was a single man, I wouldn't be here now. Now, whether that's true
How
or
do you
not,
mean?
Well, I figure I would have done away with myself.
You have felt as desperate as that?
Oh, yes. Very, very definitely. And it is much harder living like this than it is committing suicide.
How about the people that come to see you? Do you think that in some way you may be unexpectedly violent towards them?
No, not to them, no. But I have a feeling that they can see how I feel, if that makes sense. But people have commented upon the pallor that I have at times. I get drained and I'm as white as a sheet, with strain, I presume.
What do you generally do when you get angry?
I very seldom get angry. Maybe that's part of the trouble.
What do you do?
My family know that I'm sick, and there's no quarreling to be done. They don't quarrel with me, and I don't quarrel with them. I bend over backwards to see that things go. If my daughter says she's not going to do the dishes, well, the dishes aren't done because I don't want to get into a brawl. I can't afford it because I'm bushed at a relatively slight argument. Whereas before I'd argue with you day and night and hold my head. No hell. I just can't afford to get into rows with anybody because I don't know what would happen ultimately. So I avoid it like the plague. And my family know this, at home, that is. And I'm not out enough to encounter this problem anywhere else. Never.
People are always taught from childhood not to show these things, to control themselves.
But this, I think, is one of the defective aspects of some of our teaching of children. Our education has been, don't show it, deny it, hide it.
And this makes people sick.
It obviously does. Very frequently in our work with disturbed families, we see that by improving communication, we improve the functioning of the family. We increase their control rather than decreasing it. This fear of losing control as a result of expressing our feelings is merely a distortion. It's an expression of our neurotic beliefs.
If people said when they were angry.
Yes, and able to talk about it. I don't mean to say that whenever anybody gets angry that he goes and takes a swing at somebody. But if he's able to put it in a verbal context, if he's able to talk about it, and able to learn how to drain it off that way, therefore, obviously, there'd be much less anger and hostility and aggression around in the world.
There you have a man with a pathological anxiety that has disabled him for 3 years. One of the conditions in the general area that we refer to as the psychoneuroses. He took part in the hope that his case might help others.